We will be having a talk or input lecture by Dr. Majdi Faleh regarding the Medina of Tunis urban and architecture legacies of urban and architectural heritage. So before we begin, I would like to introduce a little bit introduction about Dr. Majdi. Okay, so Dr. Majdi Faleh is Assistant Prof in Architecture and Coordinator of Engage Tunisia Hub that focus on humanitarian heritage. Okay. He is an architect, architecture and urban historian, and Fulbright alumnus with a particular interest in architecture globalization, migration and architecture, ethics and aesthetics in Islamic architecture, and social justice in contemporary cities. He practiced architecture in the US, Australia, Tunisia, and France, and currently manages his design firm MWBM Architects. So, without further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Majdi to
Thank
give
you.
the input lecture. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danish. Terima kasih. Very happy to be here to share my knowledge with you, my humble knowledge with you on the Medina of Tunis, based on the research I've been conducting for the past few years on this case study. So my lecture is entitled Medina of Tunis, Legacies of Urban and Architecture Heritage. In this lecture, I'll try to, since we have students from both backgrounds, landscape architecture on one hand and architecture on the other hand. So to look at the context and general location of the Medina of Tunis in relation to Tunisia, in relation to North Africa. Then we'll delve a little bit into the history of the Medina of Tunis. We'll discuss universal value of this Medina based on UNESCO heritage factors. Later on, we'll delve into the urban morphologies and typologies within the Medina, how transition happens from fortification all the way to the unit. We'll talk a little bit about landscape and its importance within Medina, and then it's a bit of a long lecture, so I'll talk about the principles that govern the urban planning and the architecture within Medina of Tunis based on manuscripts of Ibn Rami, 14th century manuscripts. And then we'll conclude and discuss the concept, briefly, the concept of Muslim Arab cities. So if you look at the context, the overall context or historical context, you're probably familiar with some of these images. So on the right hand side, we have Hannibal, we have Carthage, the Carthaginian Empire between 1300 and 1200 BCE. You also see this image of the harbor, the harbor of Carthage, which was during that time a very dominant, very important harbor on the Mediterranean, or the shores of Mediterranean. There was lots of exchange and trade between Phoenician Empire and Carthaginian Empire, and then there was a rival later on between Carthage and Rome. There was rivalry, continuous rivalry between these two sides. So it is a very strategic location. If we go back into history, it is very strategic, very important for the Mediterranean basin. And the location itself, you can see on this world map, Tunisia is at the tip of Africa, North Africa, more precisely, very strategic location at the intersection of Africa or close to Europe as well, Southern Europe or Europe in general, and then the Middle East. So, and then you could see Malaysia here in Southeast Asia. So Tunisia has a very strategic location. And then that location is supported by the shores of the Mediterranean Sea on both sides, on the eastern side and then the northern side. And you could see on this map on the right hand side the different monuments that reflect different dynasties or dynasties of civilizations that went through Tunisia. So 3,000 years plus 3,000 years of history came with different layers, different urban layers, different dynasties, including the Phoenicians, the Romans, the Ottomans, the French colonization, etc. So many dynasties, the Husaynids, etc. So we'll talk about that when discussing Medina of Tunis. Now, when you look at this map, you probably ask the question, what do I see here and why am I using this this map. This is a technique called mental mapping, and with mental mapping, as some researchers state, it helps you to build or to display the images that are built in our minds over time. So when we look at this one in particular, we notice there is dynamism, there is diversity of functions within Medina of Tunis. You could see doors, you could see coffee shops, you could see gates, you could see cats, for example. You could see olive onion bread, library, minty, the Grand Mosque, different streets that lead to this, different activities, different people from all walks of life, different age groups, different traditions as well. So really, this mental map reflects diversity in terms of functions, and I use it on purpose here to highlight this dynamism, the images that we keep in our mind when we visit a place, images that are built over time when we visit a place. And this image in particular is it's a interesting. It's again a reflection of diversity of those layers, the economic, the social, the built environment, the political to a certain extent, etc. So, and this dynamism comes from the heart, is at the heart of the Medina of Tunis. And it's also, it makes me also think of the Kevin Lynch's book, The Image of the City, where he discusses these 5 important elements within the city, within an urban setting. You have the path that connects different parts, you have the node that is an intersection, you have the landmark that marks certain spots within a city, you have the edge at the edge of a building, a green space or a public space, and then you have a district, a neighborhood. And really these components Kevin Lynch discussed in his book, and we still rely on in urban geography nowadays, are very well present within the Medina of Tunis, the paths, the nodes, the landmarks, the edges, and the neighborhood, the district. All right. So when thinking about the Medina of Tunis, now we'll delve into its history, starting from the 7th century. So the history of Tunis goes back to Tunis itself goes back to pre-Roman times, but there are many sources that say or call this Medina Tunis. Tunis located inland from Carthage. So there is Carthage on the shore and Tunis inland, and they're separated from Mediterranean by a shallow lagoon. So both these, Tunis, and then Carthage. So the old city itself, which I'll show you shortly on a map, is rich. It is rich with monuments. It has about 700 monuments, 670 landmarks within the Medina of Tunis. Represents 9% of the population, more or less 90,000 inhabitants, 90,000 people, and it covers 6% of the total area of the capital area, so about 270 hectares. All these facts really make it distinctive in terms of layout, geographical layout, in terms of the presence, population presence. It makes it distinguished as well historically. It makes it distinguished due to presence of residential neighborhoods within Medina, but not only residential, but also commercial, but also religious, but also political. And it makes it, as we showed in the previous map, lively and dynamic center, even all these functions that are laid out. And these functions are displayed through the urban setting. So the Medina of Tunis, as I said in Arabic, Tunis, and you could see from these maps, has a very dense urban fabric. So if you look at this view from Tunis, of Tunis from the Zawiya of Sidi Bel Hassan, 1846, 19th century, you could see the lagoon we're speaking about. You could see the location, the very strategic location. You have the Lake of Tunis on one side, you have lagoons on the other side, you have the Carthage, the Mediterranean Sea here. So a very strategic location, and close to the Carthage, the harbor of Carthage. So similar to ancient Carthage, it is situated at the base of a large gulf, as we explained, sheltered from northern winds at the junction of the western and the eastern Mediterranean. So this is a source that Sebag cites describing the strategic location of Medina of Tunis. Its strategic location, it's landward side of low water lagoon on a hill which slopes gently towards the east but towers over the Sejumi Sabha, which you could see here. So a very strategic location in that sense to the west, and it made it this strategic location made it a crossroad of civilizations as well as a point of interest for invaders as well to expand their control over the Medina of Tunis. You could observe this map of 1860s, the very dense organic urban fabric of the Medina, the very complex structure of the streets, primary streets, secondary, tertiary, etc. And then its connection to the colonial city or to the European French city with a very regular and rectangular grid. So completely different urban fabric that that creates a dual city. What we talk about, what we call an urban geography dual city. So one Islamic and one is the European city. Going back into history, try to do this timeline to look at why is it strategic? Why is it the crossroad of civilizations? So it all started in the 7th century, precisely late 7th century, so 698, with the first Arab Muslim presence in Byzantine Africa. So in 703, the Arab Muslim army used Tunis as a base for attacks against Carthage. There is a construction of the Grand Mosque as well during that period. It became a military base. We're still in the same era. So around 720, it was rewalled. The Medina of Tunis was rewalled. The Jama Zaytuna rebuilt 734 CE, which is a very important mosque in the heart of the Medina, very strategic location at the intersection of north, south, east, west axes. And 9th century, it was expanded. The Medina was expanded under the Alabids, who were based in Qayrawan. The capital city was in Qayrawan. And then mid 11th century, there was invasion, Hilalian invasion. There was a suffering of the Medina or of its inhabitants. So given its a very strategic location, invasions happened on and off up until the 16th century. So 12th, 16th century is a period that marked the Medina of Tunis because it's a very strategic period and a period during which the Medina thrived under the Almohads and then the Almohads first and then later on the Hafsids. So it was one of the greatest and wealthiest cities in the Islamic world during this period. For example, I'll give you a few dates, important dates. 1160, there was the Almohads invasion, Prince Abdul Mu'min. 1222, independence from central authority. 1230, construction of the first madrasa, Shamaya by Abu Zakaria al-Hafsi. So this is a new era. The Hafsids who came later on, who helped in creating a prosperous Medina. 1249, 1264, new souks were built. There is reorganization of existing souks as well. And 1534, towards the end of this era, Tunis was occupied by Khareddin Barbaros. And the fall of the Hafsids. So now the Ottomans came and took over towards the end of 16th century. So it marks a new era. So it was always exposed to this back and forth between civilizations, dynasties, interests, etc. I'll go quickly. 16th, 18th century, Tunis was under the Ottoman and Husseinid rule. So 1574, the city became Ottoman satellite ruled by a Pasha from Istanbul, then by Turkish militaries called Deys, and then later in 17th century by the Beys. So the name changed, but they were still under the Turkish military or Turkish control, Ottoman control, let's say. Early 18th century, Hussein Bey or Hussein bin Ali founded the Husseini dynasty and ruled by a hereditary dynasty of local origin. So it became more localized under the Ottoman Empire. 1759, 82, construction of Turbat al-Bay, necropolis of Husseini princes in central Medina. So more constructions under the Husseini rule. And later in 1872, prosperous Tunis under Hamouda bin Ali Pasha. So that was a more or less prosperous era. But then in 19th, 20th century, there was the French colonization era and the modernization. 1846, for example, abolition of slavery. 1847, construction of one of the main gates, the Har. 1870-77, reforms by Minister Khairuddin Basha. And now we're getting closer to the French colonization. So 1881 is an important date that marked the history of the Medina of Tunis, or Tunis in general. French colonization happened, and a treaty of protection is called that was signed in Bardo because of short-sighted financial management plans by Minister Mustafa Khaznadar, which made the French rulers of French regime kind of sign a protect of a treaty to protect the Tunis, or to protect Tunisia during that time, but then that implied colonization. So the initial or the intention was to colonize this nation and other nations across North Africa. So officially 1881, Tunis, 82, Tunis was under the French regime, French colonized by the French. 1930, the Hara of the Jewish neighborhood, or that what we know we call now Hafsiya, has been described as an unhealthy neighborhood. 1956, independence of Tunisia. 1958, demolition of exterior gates, except a few that were left. 1959, there was an international competition within the Medina of Tunis under the first president, and there were plans to connect the European city and the historical city by creating a thoroughfare through the Medina. Luckily, it didn't happen. Otherwise, it would have meant the destruction of the urban fabric. And 1967, foundation of ASM, you'll see this name a lot, especially for those who work on Tunis. So Association Sauvegarde Medina, or the Heritage Society of the Medina of Tunis. All right. So again, different dynasties marked the Medina of Tunis, the history, but most importantly, or let's say most strategically, was the Almohads period, 1100-2169. That was kind of short. And then the longest was the Hafsid compared to the Almohad. Hafsid was longer, 1230 until 1574, and later the Ottomans. And you could see the expansion of the Almohads across North Africa and southern and northern Spain. And then the Hafsids, they had Algiers, they had Tunis, they had Tripolitana or Tripoli, they had all this area. But the Medina of Tunis was very prosperous during this time. And who are the Hafsids? So originally the Hafsids are whose era was very wealthy, descendant of a mature Berber dynasty. So the Berbers or the Amazighs are the natives of North Africa. They expanded, as you could see on the map, from western Libya through Tunisia to eastern Algeria. And then Tunis during this time reached maturity both politically, economically, geographically during this era. So it's a very important era that marked the Medina. And then during this time as well, the school of thought that marked this region was the Maliki school of thought, or Maliki school of fiqh. So there were many Maliki scholars who were selected by the rulers during the Hafsid dynasty. They were selected for high positions to represent of the state, and madrasa to represent knowledge, to represent the state, madrasa, etc. So Maliki juridical texts even were the heart of the curriculum during that time. So there was a lot of emphasis, and I'm emphasizing on this because I'll delve into towards the end into Ibn Rami's manuscript on Maliki fiqh and how that informed the urban planning of the Medina. So you could see here a modern map of Medina with one of the gates here, but part of that still remains. Few gates here and there, but this is one important one. And then there is the street Jama Zituna that leads to Jama Zituna within the Medina of Tunis. So the oldest mosque at the intersection, as I said, of two important axes, the north, south, east, west. And then you could see the urban fabric, the very organic urban fabric, and very complex. Interestingly, there are some researchers under the French colonization, they called it a chaotic system of streets, of thoroughfares, etc. but anthropologists who did research on the social and cultural behavior, the social and cultural attitudes, and how that informs the urban fabric of a setting or of the Medina of Tunis, determined that it is actually regulatory, it is based on rules, and it is informed by the culture and the social, the habits of people, of the occupants within Medina, whether it is Muslim population, Jewish, or even Christian. So it is very tied to the local culture and the local knowledge and the local fiqh when it comes to Islamic jurisprudence, rather than a random system as was described at a certain point by the colonization, basically. Before going back into the Medina, how it stands and how it is and its value, I'd like to show you this one. So you could see on the left-hand side a map of Tunis in 1910. You see the very organic urban fabric, very complex structure, and the gradual transition from main thoroughfares or main streets to secondary, tertiary. I'll come back to that in a bit. And then you could see right next to it a European city or the French city that was built under the French regime, and it has a very systematic grid, 90 degrees angles, avenues and streets that are perpendicular. That creates what I called, or what we know in urban geography as a dual city. So two cities with different histories, different urban fabrics that are evolving right next to each other. And you could see how in 1980s as well, the context, the global context around the Medina evolved. So I think it's important to show you what's outside the Medina and not just isolate the Medina itself. So you could see the fabric outside with the avenues, etc., evolving around the Medina. Now, I'm gonna spend a bit of time talking about the universal value. Why was it classified as a UNESCO World Heritage in 1979? As many other Medinas in Tunisia or other countries in North Africa. So there are many factors. As I mentioned, it is a crossroad of civilizations, Tunis in general. So it was Punic, it was Roman, it was Vandal, it was Byzantine, it was Arab, it was Spaniard for a short time, it was Ottoman, it was French colonial, and that created that richness of the entire Tunis, and then the Medina of Tunis in particular. So and these are some of the factors as mentioned. So as you could see it again, the Medina of Tunis highlighted here in yellow. I think this UNESCO quote is very important. Located in a fertile plain region of northeastern Tunisia, and a few kilometers from the sea. So and the lake as well. You could see the Lake of Tunis that connects directly to the sea as well. The Medina of Tunis is one of the first Arab Muslim towns of the Maghreb. So 698 AD, 7th century. Capital of several universally influential dynasties, represents a human settlement. This is very important. Human settlement, what does it bear? It bears the witness the interaction between architecture, urbanism, and the effects of social, cultural, economic changes of earlier culture, different layers. And the Almohads and the Hafsids, 12th to 16th century, it was the greatest, wealthiest, as mentioned before. And there are many testimonies to that. And then between 16th and 19th centuries, new powers endowed the city of Tunis with numerous palaces, residences, great mosques. There was a affluence of more construction of palaces within the Medina of Tunis during that period, zawiyas, madrasas, etc. So many functions create a dynamic urban setting within that Medina itself. Now, I'd like to spend a bit time on UNESCO, and just keep in mind 826. Right, UNESCO classification factors. So the Medina has multiple functions, complex urban fabric, logic and complex, souks, residential quarters, monuments, gates, fortification, but not much of it remains across Medinas in North Africa. So three criteria were used to classify the Medina as UNESCO heritage. The first one is criterion number 2. It played the role between, it has strategic road or location between the Maghreb, North Africa, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Southern Europe, and the East, and that helped exchange or help encourage exchange of influences in the field of arts, architecture over many centuries. So Medina played Medina of Tunis, very strategic role to connect between so Maghreb, North Africa, Southern Europe, and the East, and that helped exchange. So that's one of the criteria. The second one, which is criterion number 3, it's an important city of different dynasties, from Banu Khurasan to the Husainids. The Medina of Tunis bears witness to these civilizations of Africa or Afriqiya, essentially from the 10th century. The last one is criterion number 5. So the Medina of Tunis is important human settlement that has conserved, this is very important, its integrity or the integrity of its urban fabric with all its typomorphological components. So when you visit the Medina today, you see that many of its components are still preserved, and there was a lot of work since the 1960s in particular to preserve these components. Then the impact of socioeconomic change made this traditional settlement vulnerable, of course, exposed to many socioeconomic changes, especially post-colonization, even during colonization, and it should be fully protected. That's why there was a need to protect it by classifying it as a UNESCO World Heritage in 1979, if that makes sense. All right, so and now we're going to, from the outside, from looking at the Medina and its importance strategically as a UNESCO heritage, as a strategic location, as a vibrant node within the city of Tunis. We're going to look at the morphologies and typologies that exist within the Medina of Tunis, what I call the transitions. I like to transition or explain the transition of the urban fabric from the urban fabric itself. What is it about? Fortifications, the walls surrounding it. If some of it remains, some of it disappeared throughout time. In Cairo, for example, it remains there. Then you have the gates that lead access, then the streets, then the squares, then the souks, then the mosque, houses, courtyards. So we'll try to look at all these components. So when you look at this bird eye view of the Medina of Tunis, you could see the Zitouna Mosque here centrally located. And it is very similar, or the urban fabric very similar to many historic cities of North Africa, or Medinas as we call them in North Africa. The complexity of the urban fabric is, this is probably not the best photo, but the complexity of the urban fabric resembles a honeycomb in a hive. So very complex. The basic unit of this urban fabric is the building or the courtyard, and then it was used in houses, public facilities, etc. That creates these dynamic structures multiplied across the urban fabric with courtyards across as well. So and then public facilities which assembled with other buildings of similar form islands served by a road network hierarchy. So there are these units, these courtyards, whether it is residential or public buildings. And then there is a road network hierarchy, transition between the roads. That really adds to this complex fabric or complex layout of the Medina. Primary, secondary streets, alleys from urban dominated area by two main north, south, east, west, as we explained them, as I showed them on the map, streets. So the north-south axis and then the east-west axis of the Medina. The width of the street is not uniform, it changes throughout. And then the prospect is discontinuous. So discover the urban landscape sequence by sequence as we advance into the street or advance into the streets. So there is also this sense of excitement, urban landscape discovery, cultural landscape discovery as we delve into the Medina from the walls. So this is a reconstruction of the urban fabric I did myself, and it shows the complexity I talked about, the road network I spoke about, the main axes, east, west, north, south, etc. So again, it's this same question: is it a random grid or is it not? So, as explained before, 270 hectares, that's the total area, more than 100,000 people. The Medina comprises one-tenth of the population of Tunis. The planning has not grid lines like the European city, not perpendicular lines or formal geometric composition, but is more of an organic composition. And as I highlighted before, 1930s, some studies determined that with anthropology determined that the space of the Medina is not random. So the houses are based on a social cultural code, and the entire fabric transition between from the outside, let's say from the public, semi-public, semi-private, and then private. There is a logic behind that, according to the type of complex human relations. So the Medina today is an example of a historic city that has managed to integrate buildings of 19th century, 20th century with different functions. And then preservation is continuous. It continues on the ground, of course, with ups and downs, but it is an important phase in the life, continuous phase in the life of the Medina of Tunis. You could see the Zitouna Mosque, which is centrally located at the heart of these axes in 1899. Very dynamic place for religious education, for secular education, etc. So very vibrant, dynamic educational slash religious institution, I would say. And then you could see the variety of functions here, religious right next to the commercial, residential, etc. All right, so as we transition from the outside we have the walls, unfortunately, or the fortification, nothing much remains of that. In the Medina of Qurwan, however, the fortification was well preserved, Sus as well, etc. In Tunis, much of it disappeared. The gates, we still have some of them as a reminder of the past. So you could see here the Bab Har gate, which is one of the main gates that leads to the Medina, a very strategic one that faces or towards the lake of Tunis, so towards the European city as well. So it's very transitional point between the European and the Islamic, or between the Lake of Tunis and the Medina of Tunis. So in the 9th century, the Arab geographer Al-Yaqubi identified the structure of the Medina, where he explained that the wall was out of clay and brick, except the side facing the sea, where it was out of stone to protect that side facing the sea, basically, which you could see here. The wall is a standard architecture component that is seen in Arabic Islamic cities, as I mentioned, in other Medinas as well, as well as in Renaissance Europe. And you know the purpose for protection of life inside this settlement, and for protection of settlement from invaders as well. In the Far East as well, we could find these fortifications in China, the Great Walls, etc., the Great Wall of China, and again, it plays an important, or played an important role in terms of defense. So we could see here different gates, different bab that lead to the Medina of Tunis. And this is another view of what remains. You see that fortification disappeared on both ends. So we have, and then this is Bab al-Har, at the gate of the sea. So it is opens towards the sea, the Lake of Tunis, and then Mediterranean Sea. Not right next to it, but towards that direction. And then towards the European city as well. You could see here the fabric changes from the courtyard-based houses to more of a tall buildings with long windows, etc. So completely different fabric. So through the gates, a few of which, as I mentioned, remain today. One enters the Medina of Tunis. For example, in this case, Bab Har, from the colonial city, you enter the Medina. One enters the Medina through this gate, which is called Bab Har Gate, which has been standing alone without any walls on both sides, as you can see. Traditionally, such gates were the first encounter with the souk, or the traditional bazaars. So as you enter these gates, you'll find the souks, traditional bazaars, that lead to the central mosque later on. I'll just read a quote from Akbar, based on his book written in 1993 on the logic behind placing gates. So he states that, and gates at different levels, not only outside, but also gates in neighborhoods within the Medina. So gates are logically controlled from one side by those living within the space because of family or group of families control it. So this is, of course, a bigger scale of gates, but you find gates within the neighborhood itself that kind of determine boundaries of one neighborhood, one cluster within the Medina. Now we go to another scale to make things faster. Here we look at transition between the streets of the Medina. So transition is an expression of a complex organicity in the traditional settlement. Transition pattern reflects a common plan and scheme in traditional Islamic cities. You could observe this in Medina of Fes, you could observe this organicity and complexity in Medina of Qayrawan, etc. Marrakesh, Jerusalem, Damascus, many others. So Medina Fes, for example, is considered a spiritual center of Morocco. Medieval Fes is known for being the sacred heart and then the reflection of Islamic urbanism to ensure a secure and inviolable private space for its citizens. So we're talking about Fes, but this applies to Tunis as well. So this complex structure helps to determine or helps to preserve the life inside, the culture inside, the social codes inside this settlement. So there is a structural element here. There is a structural principle basically of Islamic urbanism. I tried to identify it here through this diagram. So transition from the ones in red, primary streets or primary, and you could see the Zituna Mosque here marked at the heart, so the gate, the Bebhar, and then the Zituna Mosque. So these are primary streets, the red ones, and then the green ones, as then you transition to the green ones, secondary streets, and then eventually you transition to the third ones, the third level, tertiary, and then the blue ones are more private, cul-de-sac. So this is where you typically the blue ones where you find the residences, the houses, etc. So you can see here transition from the primary ones that lead to the Zituna Mosque, for one of the examples, and you find shops on both ends, linear souks basically. Then you transition into second level, and then you transition into another level until you reach the last one. So until you reach the residences, and you can see how this is formed as a cul-de-sac with houses, residences. Historically, the people who live in one cul-de-sac, they had control over this area. So transition between public and private domain is very well regulated based on Islamic urbanism. You have another component that is of interest that you find at the intersection of these streets is a public square or saha or batha. It's another central element in the structure of the Medina. This is a central element that connects the flow of people and activities. It is dynamic intersection of different activities or different streets that generates dynamic social, religious, cultural activities. So you find economic as well. You find shops, you find mosques, you find different activities within this public sphere or this batha basically. I'll just cite Bassem Hakim, who's a very important scholar for those who are working in Medina of Tunis. He conducted research on the Medina of Tunis in 1980s on site. And in his book on Islamic urbanism, he explains that, quote, I'm just going to read it. These are usually formed at the wide junction of three primary streets. So he's talking about these public squares. Within the Medina, this type predominates and is usually where the mahalla or neighborhood facilities such as masjid, such as bakery or grocery shop were located. Occasionally in the Medina, the batha is a proportionate and geometrically regulated space in front of significant building. So here, for example, Sahat Ramadan Bay, if I'm not mistaken. Very similar to the description that Bassem Hakim uses in his research on his book. So it's a proportion, geometrically well-defined, regulated space, and it has many functions right next to many functions. So masjid, bakery, grocery shop, etc. Another important component is the souks or the shops. So souk, as we know, so in Medina of Tunis, there are linear souks, linear streets that lead you where you have shops on both ends. So it's a network of covered streets lined with shops, as you could see here, with different functions, ordered by specialties, so they're not confused. They are ordered within different areas based on so clothing merchants, perfumers, fruit sellers, booksellers, wool merchants, they have goods that they sell while at the souks at the heart of Medina, while fishmongers, for example, blacksmiths and potters tend to be located at the periphery of the markets because these are called clean businesses and these are unclean because they generate chemicals, they generate noise, etc. So based again on traditional or on Islamic urbanism, there is a requirement to locate them towards the periphery of the Medina to avoid chemicals, to avoid noise, etc. Just a brief note about or linearity of the Medina distribution of crafts and markets in Muslim cities. As you can see in this diagram, at the heart you find the mosque. Sometimes you find the government headquarters, depends which city you're looking at. So that's, in our case scenario, the Jama' Zaytuna Mosque. Then right next to it, you find the noble crafts, candles, bookshops, jewelers. Nowadays, you find fabrics as well, those who sell fabrics and traditional garments, clothes. Then you find, as you transition towards the periphery, you find clean crafts, utensils, hairdressers. And then you find what is termed here non-clean or dirty crafts like blacksmith crops. Probably it's best to call them unclean to a certain extent because they generate chemicals, noise, etc. But we might find a better name for that. And then you find the city wall surrounded, whatever left of the city wall. Then outside you even find the dirty or the dirtier crafts like tanneries that generate chemicals, etc. And then the main arteries or the main gates. So you can see in Islamic urbanism, there are two types of souks or shops. You have the linear ones, linear series of back-to-back shops along pedestrian main street, like you saw in Rue Jama' Zitouna or Jama' Zitouna Street. Uh, Not this one, this is from different context. I believe it's in Damascus. And then you have the concentric form around the courtyard, like when you visit Samarkand or when you visit Bukhara, you'll see this example of concentric form. So the shops are located around a courtyard and they're accessible by a single entry. But in the case of Medina of Tunis, there are more of a linear series of back-to-back shops, especially when you look at the Jama' Zitouna Street that leads to the Mosque of Zitouna. Right, I'm aware of the time. I'm trying to accelerate. So, and you have many souks, Halfaween, Kumash, and some of them are associated with media, with movies, with Ramadan series, TV series, etc. So, Souk al-Barka back then for slaves, for Souk Sabarin, Souk al-Liffa, Souk al-Grana for fabrics, and it was a souk for Jews who escaped from Portugal and Spain. They used to work there. Souk al-Truk, established by Yusuf Day. Traditional costumes, Gandura, Jibba, Farmla, etc. Souk al-Atarin, founded by the founder of the Hafsids. It had perfumes, beauty products, etc. All right. So as we transition, we find or the monument we spoke about, which is very important, Zitouna mosques or mosque at the heart of Medina, followed design architecture of previous mosques, mainly the Mosque of Uqba and Qayrawan for those who are looking at Qayrawan. And then it was later on inspiration for other mosques such as the Cordoba Mosque in Andalus in southern Spain. The courtyard, as you can see here, is accessible via 9 lateral doorways and forms a rectangle surrounded or nearly rectangle surrounded by galleries supported by columns. Many of these columns came from the ancient site of Carthage. They're made of marble. When you visit the, inshallah, next year, hopefully you'll visit the, you'll see marble, granite, porphyry, etc. Many different materials that come primarily from the Roman site of, or the ancient site of Carthage. So the square minaret, as you could see here, very well present, and there are many additions as you could see in the plan. So this part, hypostyle, hypostyle mosque, naturally, as you can see, a multitude of columns across. So this part was built first in 9th century, then 10th century, the extension of these galleries, then 13th, 16th century extension on this end of the mosque and the axis here, and then the 19th century with the addition of the minaret, the square minaret, which you see here, very present, very uh, an important marker of the overall landscape or of the space of the Medina. So it rises on the northwest corner of the courtyard. It was built, as we mentioned, late 1800, 1894, and it is 43 meters tall. You could see the prayer halls and diversity within those columns in terms of materials, the intricate geometry used for the mahrab, the niche, etc. All right, so I'm not gonna discuss this in detail so that we're able to finish. As we transition, so we are transitioning from one scale to another. We transition into the unit, the house, or a dar in Tunisian Arabic or in Arabic. It's a very important component within Medina because it houses the majority of the occupants, those who live or who used to live in a dar. So from the public square or the place or la place publique, one travels to the unit through those the transition I explained of the streets. Depending on the scale, the house can be small or large. From the outside, what is interesting from the outside, uh, well, I have an image here of Dar al From the outside, you really don't see much. You only see few openings. You see the main door and few windows that help get light through, etc. But then that's a very important feature of within what we call Islamic architecture, that sense of humility, avoiding excess by not showing the richness of the inhabitants or richness of the occupants or the owners on the facade. I'm not comparing with 21st century, but I'm implying it. So it's an interesting spirit or interesting way of not showing the wealth on the facade, but rather showing the wealth on the inside or within the courtyard. So as you make transition towards the interior space, as you can see here, the courtyard, privacy is at the heart of this sanctuary. That's another reason why you see small openings on the outside, but then the life takes place in the inside. So there is a transition from the main entrance. This case scenario, we're looking at Dar al which is where ISM or Heritage Society is. So you transition from the main street here. You make your way up through these nice steps gently up, and then you make your way into waiting area, then the street, then triba, etc. So you really transition from one space to another, as you see on this diagram, all the way to the main courtyard, and there are other courtyards. Depends on the scale of the house or the scale of the qasr, the palace, etc. It is large or not, etc. So there is that continuous transition from the outside to the inside. You don't enter the house directly from the street, but there is that sense of protecting privacy inside, based again on Islamic fiqh. It is very important element of the culture. And you could see the courtyard, the representation of the courtyards within the Medina of Tunis. There is a lot to be said, but I'm trying to give you an overview of what happens or how are these structured. The courtyard as well, which you can see here, is a climatic regulator because of the very hot weather conditions. The walls are typically thick, maybe 50 centimeters up to an average of 50 centimeters thick, built with stones, good quality that preserves the inside environment of these rooms, of these spaces, from the heat, from the harsh heat. So in the Maghribi houses of North Africa, Wast Dar, or the center, Wast Dar, the center of the house, is a very central element that spatially defines the perimeter and limits of the room surrounded. It is also a climatic regulator, as I mentioned here, because it helps for ventilation purposes. These houses or these rooms are shaded as well with these galleries, so there is that protection of these places or these residences, these rooms inside. But then there is a connection also with the outside environment through the sky. So this courtyard is open towards towards the sky, basically open, and then that helps to create a micro environment within that courtyard. So you could see more examples of diversity of courtyards or Wustadar, as I mentioned, it helps to protect the privacy, social function. It helps to regulate the climate inside, protect the house from the heat, to ventilate as well, ventilation purposes. It's a very important enclosure that we reach at the end of this transition from the fortification, the wall, the streets, the Saha Batha, and then the Qil de Sak eventually, and then the transition through the different components, Khifa, Driba, etc., within the house, all the way to the main courtyard. You can see this example from Darwin Gissen, that is managed by our dear colleague Laila bin Gissen. So most of the courtyards of the Medina are from the 18th century. In this case scenario, this 21st century image shows you the dynamics, a variety of functions that could take place inside those courtyards, but also the variety of the decoration, the geometry, complex geometry on the walls, the tiles, the tile and work, etc., the materials, the kathal, the marble, the offset seed, etc. So really that diversity that is created within that courtyard, it's a place or a room. There is a room for creativity, or there has been a room for creativity within that sanctuary. That sanctuary that protects the life of the inhabitants. All right, so let's go quickly to finish. You can see here more images, diversity of materiality. The green, the water, there is a well typically there, diversity of tiles in both sections that defines this area versus this area, and some of the arches as well, Hafsid era arches, the columns, etc. All right, landscaping is very important. As you appreciated in Medina, light is a central element in this type of architecture, in Tunisian architecture, North African traditional architecture. The doors are also a marker of the space within the Medina of Tunis. You see a variety of, or other Medinas as well, variety of colors, tones, techniques on the doors of the Medina. So it's an interface that calls for interaction, but also creates, it's a somehow piece of art along the street. So you see diverse colors, yellow, blue, etc., diverse scales, etc. So we could give a whole lecture on the doors themselves. You could see also the Musharabiyya or Ganaria, or we know it as Musharabiyya. So this lattice window that pops out of the facade and that helps filter light, the blue one you see here, helps filter light, air inside, but also provides visual privacy for those who are inside looking towards outside. So it's a double function against social function, and then the environmental function, as you can see here. Landscaping is very important. You can see the Bougainvillea. There has been few projects. Friend entrepreneur Laila bin Ghassan was involved in one of the projects in Al Pasha Street, where her project is Darwin Ghassan. So landscaping is very important, or all these layers are very important. The light, the water, even the water, the doors, greenery, or recycling of the water is very important. It's a very important principle in Islamic urbanism, not to waste water, to recycle it, to reuse it, etc. All right, now I come to my last part because it's already 8:57, and I'm gonna talk briefly about the Islamic city principles based on Ibn Rami. This scholar from the Basim Hakim 1980s has written a lot about him. And then the book or the manuscript, which is available in Arabic of Ibn Rami, written 14th century, was translated or edited, introduced by Basim Hakim. His name is very important, should keep in mind, and translated later on. So, who is Ibn Rami? Ibn Rami is a master builder by the name of Ibn Rami. He wrote a complete treatise on building construction. He used a lot of the material from those early Arabic manuscripts. His book is Al-A'lan bi Ahkam al-Bunyan, so was written 14th century. And he used manuscripts of Ibn al-Imams and many other legal treatise manuscripts. He included his own experience and interpretations from being a master builder, but he also had connection to the judges, so he would understand those laws and regulation. And interestingly enough, if you read books from that time, even people who lived within Medina, within, say, for example, a cul-de-sac, they would manage, as I said, they could have a gate. They would manage. They would know about the laws and regulation within that small district. They would have interaction with the judges, etc. There was that vibrancy within the connection between the citizens and the rulers and the judges, etc. So before delving into, I think this is an important concept to mention in Islamic architecture. We talk about hidden architecture, or as some architecture historians termed it, architecture of the veil. So of the veil, because it is an architecture that tries to is embedded in a certain social and cultural code and religious atmosphere as well. But it also introduces an ethic, a further ethic, which was developed to promote a sense of privacy. Privacy is very important. Privacy, Muslim culture, and Islamic faith was an expression or expressed to create protection against the outside world. Among family members, between the family members and visitors. It produces respect for the rights and guests and visitors, respect for the rights of neighbors, and relationship between men and women, between women and women, men and men, etc. There are many manuscripts, even 12th century, that are written about, which I explore myself on this concept of privacy, or another ahkam, that was written during that period, 12th century, that regulates the vision, basically. Another is vision, and I think it was really well translated into the architecture of these settlements. So going back to Medina of Tunis, some of the principles that Ibn Rami discusses in his 14th century treatise stem from Maliki fiqh, and they influenced the urbanism within that Medina. So the Quran itself did not have regulations on you should do this, you should do that in terms of urbanism, but there were principles, there were ayats, there were hadiths as well that would regulate our urban space, would regulate our behavior, our relation to the neighbor, and that had direct influence on the way these cities were planned. So the Medina, part of these principles is removing danger, privacy, importance of respecting privacy, priority of neighbors, existing neighbor versus the new neighbor, the height of the building, respect of the neighbor, public street, importance of public street, avoiding obstacles, avoiding excess, avoiding obstacles so that water doesn't run into different directions. And this regulating activities, so the clean ones next to the center, next to the mosque, the other ones towards the border or the periphery of the Medina. Now we come to this, trying to take a short break. So urban principles, again explained based on the principle of la darar wa la dirar in Islamic urbanism. So harm, for example, an action of a dweller should not present a potential risk or danger by presenting nuisance to the other neighbor. So it's very important. Hakim explains even in his book that the essence of this principle comes from In the Quran, for example, Allah said, "O ye who believe, eat not up your property among yourselves in vanities, but let there be among you traffic and trade by mutual goodwill, nor kill or destroy yourselves, for verily God hath been to you most merciful." In the hadith as well, do not harm others. Prophet Muhammad says, "Do not harm others or yourself, and others should not harm you or themselves." So this idea of la darar wala dirar, do not harm others, and others should not harm you. So and it kind of helped Ibn Rami later on, the son Hakim, write these treaties. So interdependence, there is a regulation with the compartments in the Medina, privacy, avoid viewing the interior of spacious courtyards. It, I'll is there something? I'll finish very soon. Okay, so priority of neighbors who settled before, height, the right to build vertically while limiting the height to allow air and sun rays. Many principles we use in 21st century cities. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't respect them. Respect of other properties, public streets, for example, equal to 3.5 meters, which is distance for two camels to cross based on the hadith. Obstacles, there should be no obstacle in the street, not to block water, the flow of water when it rains, for example. Excess, no excess, no blocking of the excess of water. The right use the concept of fina, of juxtaposing spaces by the dweller of the adjacent house. So there was that mutual sharing and activities, non-clean ones, as we explained. We don't need to explain this again. So visual privacy is very important. You could see these examples from Medina of Tunis, Medina of Qayrawan, and these small openings on this very whitewashed facade, very minimalistic facade with those few openings and the main door that ensures the transition. So both windows and doors, as you can see here, are elements contributing to visual privacy. Maintaining visual privacy inside Medinas, it is necessary to understand how these elements are placed to play a role in protecting the inner spaces of the home based on, in this case scenario, Maliki scholars or Maliki fiqh. For example, I'm going to read Maliki scholar Ibn al-Imam states that overlooking is about visual corridors that compromise privacy generated by the location of doors, windows, openings, and heights. So there is this emphasis on protecting the inside or visual corridors, as he termed, by taking consideration placement of doors, windows, heights, etc. I drew a few of these diagrams as part of my doctoral research, looking at regulating window heights in the Medina of Tunis, for example. So as you could see here, in the manuscript or treatise of Ibn Rami, he was very well explained based on cases with judges, based on discussions with judges. So it's like mini stories in that book, very interesting. So the sill, for example, should be 175 centimeters, 1 meter 75, to be considered adequate, because in this case scenario, you cannot see or cannot have direct visual privacy of direct so you cannot have direct vision towards the neighbors, or you cannot see what happens inside their houses, etc. Overall, the rule is that the sight line from an exterior window should be above the head level of a standing person who is inside. So the sight line should be above the head level of a person who is inside. Like in this case scenario, the sight is above, so you cannot really see what happens inside the space. So there are many cases. I only picked some of them. In more detailed cases about new windows, for example, Khalifa Umar ibn Khattab mentioned that when a man builds a room with a new window, then the ruling is to place a bed behind that window. And when you stand on that bed, if you cannot see what happens in neighbors or through in the neighbor's house or privacy, then you could do that. You could have that window, and there are many rules that explain these principles and relate them to Islamic urbanism or fiqh. So, to ensure visual protection between neighbors, as I mentioned, it was ruled out that a window should not be low enough to allow a passerby to look inside the house. So, this is my street. If I'm here and the window is low as here, then I could see what happens in the privacy of the house. So, that's based on Maliki fiqh. During that time, that is a no. So, that's why the window should be placed up, and then you place a bed here and stand on it. And by doing that, you realize that the window is high enough, so there would be no visual intrusion. There is also ruling about placement of the doors back then. So if the street is 3.08, I converted that into meters. Then you could place doors facing each other on both ends of the street. If 220, then you should place them. The axis of the door should be offset, etc. If you have a door, a house, a residence, and a shop, and 3 meters wide. The street should be 3 meters wide. Otherwise, they shouldn't face each other. This door and the shop basically, and so on and so forth. So there are many cases described by Ibn Rami, but they are of interest because they explain how things were organized, how windows were organized, how streets were organized, how the width was organized. I come to the last part. So the excess bit beyond, I'll read this quote. So designs are more likely to succeed to be accepted by the local community when the people who live in a place are included in the design process. They bring knowledge of the particularity of a place and are empowered through direct participation in shaping their environment. So this is 21st century quote, but actually applies to the Medina of Tunis because people who lived in that place were included in that design process. People knew about the regulations, discussed them, and people managed their own cul-de-sac, their own compartment with 3, 4 houses, for example. And that brings us to the nearly to the end of, I think I stopped screen sharing already, of our presentation. But just to conclude, I would say Muslim Arab cities, they reflected how the society interacted with the natural environment through the courtyards, for example, through that transition. They also organized, consumed available materials within that site to respond to complex cultural, religious, economic, physical factors, as you saw, the way they place the souks, the way they place functions, so on and so forth. And the urban fabric itself, the one you saw, the very complex urban fabric, evolved with time. So it was dense and organic and effectively responded to the cultural and natural requirements. So the natural requirements, the weather, and then the cultural requirements, social cultural codes, as you saw. And there, I only shared a few cases, but there are hundreds of cases on from within the Medina and other Medinas on Islamic urbanism. I hope that was useful. Probably took a bit over an hour.